wish you could swim like the dolphins, like the dolphins could swim. Though nothing will keep us together, we can beat them forever and ever.
Hi, this is John Cullen. Welcome to another episode of Hypothetically Speaking. In this episode, my guest is Dr. Mark Changizi. Dr. Changizi was born in New Jersey, and he went to the Thomas Jefferson High School for Science and Technology. I went to the Bronx High School of Science, so we went to similar high schools. But Dr. Changizi went on to get his PhD at University of Maryland and is a theoretical cognitive scientist. And it's a great pleasure and a great honor to introduce you to the audience. So welcome to the show, Dr. Mark Changizi.
Great to be here. Good to meet you.
It's a real honor. So we met on Twitter. Seems like I'm meeting most of the people I know on Twitter. And how did we get connected? What happened there?
I really can't recall. I'm not sure. I don't think I got to know about you until probably more like the last year and a half. I think we hadn't really converged and found each other, as is the case, back in March of 2020. All of us were alone and surrounded by an echo chamber of the beginnings of totalitarianism, and felt like we were crazy. Mm-hmm. And then luckily we were able to find one another and convince ourselves, okay, we're not we're not crazy for suggesting 2 + 2 = 4. But so it took us a little while longer to find each other.
Indeed. So I know we connected on Twitter. And the thing that stood out for me was the fact that you're an expert in cognitive sciences and perception, and in particular, color perception. And so if the audience isn't familiar with your commercial work, you have a company that makes special glasses for people that suffer from color blindness. And you also make glasses for technicians that helps them find people's veins that are particularly difficult to find. Am I right about that?
That's right. Yeah, I mean, the short story there is that, for 100 years, they thought that color vision in us primates, we have a third dimension that other mammals don't have. They see yellow, blue, they see grayscale, but some of us primates have red, green. And for 100 years, they thought that that had something to do with finding fruit in the forest. And back almost 20 years ago, when I was at Caltech, I provided evidence and argument, sort of a seminal paper, arguing that the peculiar kind of color vision that we primates have is actually optimized for seeing. It's exactly the peculiarity you need to see blood oxygenation modulations under the skin. Why would we want to see that? It's not that we care about oxygenation modulations, but it's by virtue of seeing that allows us to see blushes and blanches and flushes and all of these states. Your skin is actually semi-transparent. It's highly transparent. This is why you bruise, you see all of that, change of color. It's because your skin is basically almost completely transparent. The color that you see on healthy skin is due to the blood. And so only having our peculiar kind of color vision allows you to see that. So out of that discovery came technology for vein finder technology for medical personnel, color blindness technology, because colorblind, mostly men, they're deficient at seeing these emotional signals. And our ability to augment that oxygenation signal not only helps vein finder folks, but also helps color deficient, mostly guys, at seeing that signal. All of the other color blindness stuff that these other companies are just sort of shifting colors around, and they're actually making it harder to see these very emotional signals that we evolved color for.
Interesting. Very interesting. Now, I know that there are these standard colorblind tests. In fact, there's some of them on your website, right? And they give these tests to people when they're taking certain driver's license tests, I believe, or tests to fly an airplane. Again, can you help us? Like, what does that mean? Like, when somebody has this degree of colorblindness, that they can't drive a car? Like, why would that be? Because they can't tell red from green from yellow?
Well, yeah, some of these Yeah, I mean, some of these fields, there are a propensity of colors that are needed on the dashboard, or red-green lights differences, and so there has been, in some cases, in some countries, and some, here and there, even doctors in some cases, some countries were required to be passing a color blindness test. In normal life, it doesn't plague you like it can in certain kinds of fields where you happen to have a red and a green, because reds and greens don't usually perfectly match, even if you're color deficient, because in order for them to match, you have to basically be an evil perceptual psychologist who's created a color blindness test where the reds and the greens are exactly the same in terms of their yellow and blue contribution. Like they're balanced on that, and they're balanced on their grayscale. So they're only distinguishable by red, green, which you're deficient at. That rarely happens in normal life. One of the few places that it actually happens is blood under the skin, because you're actually titrated to see exactly the oxygenation, deoxygenation of blood. So when you are red, green deficient, you really can't see those signals. But mostly in life, things are not purposely balanced. So there's always the ability to see them via these other dimensions that we have access to.
There's an aspect of your work that gets into these perceptions and a degree of illusion, right? And how there's some pre-perception or preconception. I'm sure I'm butchering it terribly, but I understand, as I was reading more about your background, that there's a certain illusory aspect to this. Can you help us understand that a little better?
Yeah, so this doesn't have anything to do with color. So one of my TED Talks is on why we see illusions. So there's all these standard illusions that you've seen before where, hey, these two lines are vertical, but there's all of these, like these radiating lines, and you instead perceive those two lines as bowing outwards.
Why do we see illusions? I'm going to tell you about some of my research where I provided evidence for a different kind of hypothesis than the one that may be on the book on your coffee stand. All right, so let's look at one of the illusions here. And this is a stand-in for many, many kinds of illusions that are explained by this hypothesis. I'm just going to walk through it for this particular one. As usual in these things, these two lines are in fact parallel, but you perceive them to bow outwards at their centers. They're at the center where those radial lines are, it's wider in your visual field than the parts above and below. And this is remarkable because it's a remarkably simple stimulus. It's just a bunch of straight lines. Why should one of the most complicated objects in the universe be unable to render this incredibly simple image?
And that's one whole class of illusion. So, and I don't have time or the ability to get in here. There's another 50 classes that the same kind of theory that I'm about to mention can explain. But the short story here is that all of these illusions are due to the fact that your brain has delays. When light hits the back of your retina, you do not instantaneously generate a perception, right? You would like it. It would be kind of cool if, like, oh yeah, I've created a perception instantaneously, but you can't. It takes a tenth of a second. And a tenth of a second is a long time. A lot of stuff happens in a tenth of a second. Even if you're just moving at 1 meter per second, you've moved 10 centimeters in a tenth of a second. And we're usually not moving as slowly as 1 meter per second. And so, not to mention when people are throwing things at you and so forth. So what you want your brain to do is not generate a perception of the way the world was when light hit the back of your retina. You want to guess what the world is going to look like in a tenth of a second, so that by the time you've built your perception, which takes a tenth of a second, you have a good guess of what the world will look like by that time. You want a perception of the present. Right? And so I was able to show that that's in fact what's going on, and that explains all of these classical optical geometrical illusions, as well as many other classes of illusions follow from that same kind of idea.
Well, one of the illusions that I've used many times in my videos to help people understand that you don't necessarily see everything that you think you see is the selective perception test.
This is a test of selective attention. Count how many times the players wearing white pass the basketball. How many passes did you count? The correct answer is 15 passes. But did you see the gorilla?
The gorilla illusion. And I've used it many, many times. And so clearly we know that that light is hitting the retina, but it just simply isn't registering whatsoever in the brain. And you're just completely shutting it out. But the light is there, right? The sense, it's certainly hitting the retina. And so I imagine the gorilla illusion is one of those selective perception type categories, right? One of your 50 or so, right?
No, I mean, so that would be a very different kind of thing. That's not due to your brain trying to correct for these neural delays. That's a different kind of thing. You only have a certain amount of attention capacity, and in any given situation, you attend selectively to certain kinds of things that you think matter, and you can't absorb every single everything. You can't attend to everything, and so that's a very different kind of illusion. These, in the case of the illusions that you're having are actually advantageous, because in normal life, I'd like to give a hint to what the explanation is. All of those radiating lines, you've got two vertical lines and you perceive them to be bowing outwards, but it's in the midst of all of these radiating lines like spokes on a tire. Mm-hmm. In normal life, when you're walking through the world all day long, whenever we walk forward, all the things in our visual field are flowing outwards in our visual field. Mm-hmm. That means that they're creating little optical streaks on the back of your retina, and they're all flowing outwards. So you end up with like when you're going into warp on Star Trek, mm-hmm. all of the stars go outwards. Well, that's constantly happening. And so what those optical radiating lines are in the images of these geometrical illusions, it's an exaggeration. It's sort of an extreme artistic exaggeration of the kinds of cues that we always have, that we are moving forward roughly towards the center of those converging lines. So when your brain sees it, it goes, holy shit, right now I'm moving towards the center of those things. That's all this optic flow tells me that. I need to generate a perception of what those two vertical lines, like the sides of a doorway, how they're going to project in about 1/10 of a second were I moving between those two doors. And when you work out how two doorways flow outwards in your visual field, they flow out more quickly at eye level. Mm-hmm. But if you imagine that it's a tall cathedral ceiling, just to make it exaggerated, when you get really close, when you look up, the cathedral ceiling, the cathedral doorways are going to go towards one another like railroad tracks in the sky. And so that when you're far away, the whole thing is sort of perfectly vertical in your visual field. But when you get close, it's bowed outwards more in your visual field than does the high part. So that's a part of just normal projective geometry. And so it's trying to anticipate. Acrobatic monkey all the time, these primates that we are, is due to our brains constantly doing that. These are only illusions in the sense that it's saying there's optic flow, it's saying you're moving forward, but you're not moving forward. So it's creating a correction that just never happens. If it's perceiving the next moment, that moment never happens because it's just a static piece of paper.
Well, from my perspective, just knowing the little bit that I do about your work, I've seen evidence of someone somewhere, somehow taking advantage of what I consider to be biases here towards color, right? We know that there are color biases, right? And restaurants and places like that take advantage of that in their packaging and their advertising. Have we seen the use of these biases as far as in the world of COVID? And I'll show you examples of where I think I've seen it, but have you seen examples of it? Like, how have you leveraged your skill set in disassembling this narrative around the COVID pandemic?
In terms of color, it hasn't really come up too much, and we're only just touching the surface on a lot of the kinds of things that I've worked on. But the one place that off the cuff where it has come up was in the first year when governments and certain foundations, especially I remember one in the UK, creating these well put together 3 or 4 minute videos showing gross things in the air coming out of their mouths and making people look like they're covered in COVID and their green little pustule cooties like stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And that was tapping into the colors in the general disgust instincts that we have. So there's a lot of that going on consciously. And, the extent to which any of these people actually mind the literature of color, there's a lot of color associations literature that's out there. They're real associations. A lot of industries at least implicitly get it. They often are just following copycatting, and it's culturally evolved to work so that, the red and orange, table covers at Pizza Hut tends to invite you to eat more. There's a lot of things like how well optimized they are is unclear, but I bet there's just been a lot of cultural optimization over time. And if we had this pandemic continuing for another 15 years, probably the optimization of all of these stimuli, color stimuli as well, would be probably more highly evolved than it was in the first year.
Okay. Did you get a chance to take a look at the Johns Hopkins map that they put out? That they published this map of the COVID pandemic, and I might have sent you an email with the March.
Yeah, back in early March.
Right, exactly.
Of 2020.
Right. So the thing that kind of jumped out at me, I'm the guy that headed the team at Oracle that worked with the SRI to build the mapping system back in the 1980s. And when I took a look at the map, I said, well, where's all the amber? Where's all the green?
Yeah.
Everybody's red?
I don't know. I'll just really see it, but it's nice to see. Just looks like blood splotches everywhere, all over the Europe. And
so I'm looking at this. This is March 13th. And the thing that jumped out at me was, well, wait a second. The whole thing is red. I see China's red all over the place. And yet, I'm looking at the report. Now, this is the part that you just said a couple of minutes ago. Sometimes we can only take in a certain amount of data. So you look at this map, but do you really take a minute to look at the cities? And when you look at the cities, Hong Kong didn't have 10 dead. Shanghai didn't have 10 dead. And Beijing didn't have 10 dead. And I'm looking, I'm like, well, why are the circles so big? And why is everything red here? Vietnam is red. Vietnam had nobody dead. If there's no one dead in Vietnam, they don't get a yellow? Come on. You don't deserve a yellow if there's no one dead. You're already red. Why are you already red? And the fact that the whole thing was red tipped me off as one of the guys who built the damn thing. It was, who did this? Who configured this where everything is red? And is that a bit of a piece of evidence that something strange is going on? Why would Johns Hopkins do something like this? Why would the Michael Bloomberg School of Health at Johns Hopkins do something like this?
No lie can deny that light, and we will not allow any president to dim that light. Over these past 3 months, I've seen that light shining in the faces of millions of Americans, in every person who was part of our campaign, and in everyone from every political party who believes that we must begin bringing our country back together and putting the united back in the United States of America. And so today, our campaign today for the presidency ends, but our campaign for a better America, a stronger America, a more just America, a more equal America, and a more united America continues. And together, We will get it done. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, if that's a more than a rhetorical question, I mean, unfortunately, that's just the tip of the iceberg of a million such exaggerated panic driving, hysteria driving communications that occurred in early March. And I think that was that seems to have been what, March 13. I'd say the climax of it in terms of causing this new righteous COVID religion was on March 11th itself. We had to pick a day. And it had been leading up to that and really climax. And once we got that point, I think it kind of a phase change had happened, and much of the earth had created a new kinds of taboos of what you shouldn't be allowed to do. And it was totally okay to prevent those things by, it's always okay to, people don't consider them to be civil liberties violations if you are making taboos illegal. For example, none of us think that adult incest being illegal is much of a civil liberties violation, right? I mean, let's say an adult brother and sister is just disgusting. None of us are really bothered by this. Strictly speaking, I guess it's a violation of civil liberties. Two adults should be able to do whatever they want, but we don't. And it quickly became taboo. And so on March 13th, I think, actually, I was out there with my CrossFit friends in the park, and a lady pulled over, 50 years old, ran out there, said, "Who do you guys think you are?" We were not in the gym. We were outdoors because of the whole culture at the time. We kind of had to, otherwise they could have shut the gym down. Right. And she kept screaming at us, and so we had to pick up our CrossFit things and run across the field just to get away from her. Those are the beginnings of totalitarian forces, and that's when people have the gall to go attack you with righteous indignation. And this is well before masks. This was even before lockdowns were implemented in our state. 1 billion or even 1 million or even 100,000 people like that are all you need for totalitarianism to happen. Those people,
no doubt,
they'll police it on the street. They'll snitch on the street. They will encourage and make sure that there are top-down legislations then legislating or at least mandating the kinds of interventions that they want. And so we saw both top-down, which of course were the authoritarianism, but even worse, this is decentralized authoritarianism. That's what totalitarianism is, and a lot of people still don't recognize that's what we had to brush with and are still trying to brush off of us.
It's very effective, right? So when you can start getting the Karens to enforce everything, boy, oh boy, it's a two-tier system. It's very, very effective. I'm fascinated though by Johns Hopkins University's choice, their mapping choice, because this map was used on television. I mean, this was sort of the go-to tool early in the pandemic to communicate to the public the extent of this outbreak. And it was very, very red. I mean, you can't get, like in Spinal Tap, right? You can't get a whole lot redder than this map that we're looking at, right? I mean, in Spinal Tap, you said, the album is black. You can't get any blacker than this.
I think he's right. There's something about this that's so black. It's like, how much more black could this be? And the answer is none. None
is that good?
More black.
I think you're rationalising this whole thing into something that you did on purpose. I think we're stuck with a very stupid and a very dismal looking album. This is depressing.
You can't get a map that's a whole lot redder than this map that we're looking at from March 13th, and yet Shanghai didn't have 10 dead. Now,
that is a level of redness of 11, right? Yeah. So
exactly. So it's like you couldn't have made this map more red yet, with Shanghai having less than 10 dead and Beijing having less than 10 dead and Hong Kong having less than 10 dead. I'm here scratching my head saying, well, wait a second, how did all of the epidemiologists and virologists miss that part?
Jumped up like a lion, tangles in my hair. Call me what you want, I don't care. I'm on fire. Jumped up like a lion, tangles in my hair. Call me what you want, I don't care. I'm on fire in my underwear, doing what I want like a millionaire. I turn it up another notch. I rock it loud and make it hot.
And how did the news media, in other words, to Anderson Cooper on March 13th or 15th or 18th, there still weren't 10 dead in Shanghai, Beijing, or Hong Kong. So you see the map, and the map sure looks terrifying, but there's no one dead in Vietnam. Zero, nobody. Now, to me, that's like evidence of subterfuge. I mean, maybe I'm taking it too far, but it sure looks extreme. There's no one
Well, I
that
mean,
help me here.
I mean, that's just one of too many. And this is one problem with totalitarianism. At the end of Nazi Germany, only a dozen people were hung, right? And there's just so many culpable that you really have to focus on the higher value targets that were had greater responsibility, bigger voices, and pushed for longer. Some people pushed for just 2 weeks and then woke up.
Mm-hmm.
They failed us, but much less so than those that are still pushing 3 years later, right? But the number of people, all of my tweets are in the first 3 days. By the first 3 days, I mean March 10, 11, and 12. That's my first tweet on COVID was on March 10th, 2020, and already it was an argument. So it's like, here are the infection fatality rate numbers. In fact, I wasn't even at that point clear between IFR and CFR until a couple, 3 or 4 days later. I said, here's the fatality rate numbers, and these are quite low. Here's the Princess Cruise. In fact, the articles that I was pointing to were all the ones that became even more panicked 2 weeks later. This is BBC, ABC. They were actually saying reasoned, normal things. Here's the data from China. And people were responding to me saying, how dare you? Are you a denier? Already these words are starting to pop up. You're a denier. You are trying to lower the risks here, and that's super dangerous to do that. And I said, no, the dangers are that you're going to create hysteria and all the consequences that happen because people are madly dashing to only minimize one thing at the expense of everything else, which is in fact what happened.
Yeah, we've explored this notion of the spiral of silence and the social pressure on professionals, on physicians, PhDs, research professionals who started to speak out. You spoke out early, but you're independent. You've got your own business, right? And you're less dependent, I imagine, on things like research money and things like that than a lot of these other folks out there who, they've got to keep the research money coming. They got to keep writing the papers. And the spiral of silence is very powerful. The social pressure to, especially when we started to hear that doctors like Paul Marik were losing their job. Dr. Scott Jensen in Minnesota, he was being threatened with his medical license. And you're talking about physicians who've been practicing 30, 40 years. And you're gonna take their medical license away? I mean, this was remarkable. What is your take on sort of that social pressure, that spiral of silence to help suppress alternative narratives?
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think that yes, there was some fraction that were silent. My own feeling that, and I have academics who reached out to me and would say, I'm on your side, but I can't speak up. But the number of people that were like this were very small. And my opinion is that most of academia, a high majority of academia, yes, they are of course pressured to be, to hold on to the narrative or pretend they're help, but they, I think, actually came to believe the narrative. When you're in an environment like that and you're surrounded by everybody around you that's high reputation, all of us believe what we believe because of the network around us, where we sit within the network. High reputation folks, 99.99% of everything I believe is because people told me the stuff and I didn't check the data myself. I happen to be a scientist, so I've got a couple dozen things that I did that I know because I actually did it. All the rest is because of that. These people sit already in an incredibly far left, 98% far left environment, already packaged and ready for groupthink. So I really didn't get very few people reached out to me saying, good for you that you're speaking up, but I can't, or anything like this, or I feel bad, or no, almost nobody. These people were, in fact, usually reaching out to me, attacking me, or no longer talking to me anymore, or saying you should be explicitly, between science journalists and actual scientists and academics themselves, berating me and saying I've lost my mind. These people were believers, in my opinion. The problem was, there's always some fraction, whether it's 10% or 90% of the people who were just keeping their heads down but realize something's off. I feel like the fraction that was that type was really small. I'm not sure the numbers, but I feel like that was a minority, and the majority were in on it religiously. So
meaning they fell for it. They fell for the story hook, line, and sinker.
They fell for it. and contributed to it, and it just becomes its own sort of narrative on its own with the
So in your opinion, what has happened to first principles? I mean, are we a rare breed, people who take the time to look at the data, to do the work and say, wait a second, something, I don't know. For me, I get a sense of cognitive dissonance, right? I get a sense something's up. And then I start to dig in and find information that leads me to come to the conclusion that the standard narrative isn't really what's happening here. Yeah. What happened to first principles? It seems like it's such a rare thing now.
Yeah, and I think, and you're right for not mentioning the thing that some people mention is that, why are these people so dumb? These people aren't dumb. The people that I'm referring to, many of these people are much smarter than me on some IQ test. Yeah. These are brilliant people, and that I think potentially worked against them. If I was saved by this, I think there's only two reasons that I potentially escaped it, because I think I'm equally ripe for social contagion. And I've always known that I'm ripe for social contagion. And so I've always kept myself aloof. I even would write aloof, socially aloof. And I did this not for political reasons, socio-political reasons. I did it because as a theorist, I move on to different kinds of fields. So, I've got stuff on why the brain is shaped the way it is and how we came to have music and language and cultural evolution kinds of things. Many different kinds of how do we get pruny fingers when you're wet? These are always in new fields. Every time it's always a new field. I can't stick around in one field and get stuck within one conference community and slowly grow within that community. And then everybody's kissing my ass because I have a little bit of gray and I've already got more papers than them. And the girls are batting that. We love that. Humans love that so much, but it completely lobotomizes you and prevents you from moving into new fields. So I've always understood that I'm ripe for that. So I always kept myself, this is why I left academia. I started my own research institute and my own business to help support and make me academically free and aloof. And I think that's what saved me, because none of us expected to sit, there might be a social contagion that we have to insulate ourselves from in the scale that we saw in March of 2020. This was not on my radar, right? I don't think it was on anybody's radar to be somewhere, but I think I was saved because of that. And the other is, my commitment to civil liberties has always been explicit and strong ever since I've been young. I've been a strong little L libertarian, classical liberal, and always for deontological reasons. There's my justification for libertarianism isn't utilitarian. My justification for libertarianism is not to maximize the amount of liberty. It's that you have no right to violate or use coercion against another individual except for self-defense. It's a constraint on the actions of the state or on anybody. And if you have that kind of deep commitment to civil liberties, then when these kinds of things happen, you say, I think even if you thought, okay, everything you're saying is right, and it's an infection fatality rate of 38%, which is what Australians, the average respondent, has said. By 2020, early 2021, they still thought it was 38% infection fatality. Holy crap, right? Yeah, even if you thought it, it was 38%, then if you have an attachment to civil liberties, then you have to just say, I'm still not allowed to do these things. I'm not allowed to violate their civil liberties, lock them down, force them to wear masks, kick them out, violate informed consent for vaccines, and use the state or even have centralized fact checkers to censor my opposition. So an understanding of not just freedom, but also free expression is crucial to what freedom democracy are. So in 2021, I started a FreeX, the Free Expression Institute, which is really devoted to trying to understand free expression, the complex emergent phenomena that make it work in understanding totalitarianism in these sorts of contexts, these kinds of complex emergent systems. And there's not that many folks with a kind of cognitive science, evolutionary kind of complex emergent systems backgrounds that are thinking about totalitarianism, free expression, and freedom. And that's really what FreeX is about. Anyway, those two things I think saved me: being aloof and true attachment to civil liberties.
Interesting. And what do you see as sort of the root cause of this lemming-like hysteria? The fact that they just, everybody just seemed to follow Dr. Fauci as the Pied Piper right off the cliff here.
Anthony Fauci. Is Dr. Anthony Fauci.
Straight to Dr. Anthony Fauci. We are lucky to have
Dr. Anthony Fauci is our country's top infectious disease doctor.
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Anthony Fauci.
The one and only Dr. Anthony Fauci.
He's been a rare source of clarity
in the Trump administration's response.
Dr. Fauci is a truth teller. He's science, knowledge, evidence, data. And that's what we have to have if we're going to have a cure.
Dr. Anthony Fauci has emerged as one doctor that just about everyone in America knows, a trusted scientific expert during this pandemic.
What do you associate that hero worship, loss of first principles, the fact that people weren't doing the work, weren't looking at the numbers, I was talking about how many pediatric COVID deaths there were in various cities. Like today, as we're recording this, the total number of school-age kids that died in Los Angeles is 18 in 3 years. So 18 school-age kids between 5 and 17 years old died in Los Angeles in a 3-year period.
And almost invariably, you could be sure these are not just kids. These are kids probably had multiple, not just one, but multiple comorbidities.
Right. Cystic fibrosis, some sort of kidney disease or something like that. Exactly right. So 18 kids in 3 years in Los Angeles. And yet this is the type of data, just specific data that nobody reports that. Like you won't see that in the LA Times. You won't see that reported. And that seems to bring up cognitive dissonance in other people. In other words, like, well, if the number is that low, why would there be all this talk about inoculating the children? Why would we need to inoculate millions of kids if 18 kids died in 3 years?
Yeah.
So it doesn't add up.
No, I mean, a lot of what happened, so there's, I guess, multiple phases of this. Once it got going March 11th or so of 2020, I think a kind of phase change happened, and much of the population of the world, and I was totally alone except for my wife and I, totally alone. And then until I found people online, much of the population had already switched over to some kind of, we didn't have the word zero COVID at that point, but a kind of zero COVID mentality. And anything and everything had to be done to work together to stop this horrible, altogether novel virus. And this included all of these obvious commonsensical interventions like lockdowns and shutdowns and so forth, none of which were obvious or in fact, they were explicitly recommended against. Trying to understand how these things, let me just say it in two phases, because then later there's lots of other, then once the governments have got involved, there's bottom up pressure, and then but governments got along. Everything that happened after that only made this worse. But I think many of those things afterwards, even if we got rid of the nudge units in the UK, I'm not sure that would have changed. It was too late. That only made things worse. They're culpable, but that's not the cause. There's another million other these kinds of forces. Those forces got rolling in early March 10th, March 11th. And once that transition happened, I think we were going to see similar kinds of cascades in various ways all over the place. And they're all culpable, but it would have, if they hadn't done it, somebody else would have done the similar kinds of things. These avalanches, you go to, when there's an avalanche happening and you go over there and you hold one boulder down and make sure you hold it to prevent the one, there's going to be other boulders that hit those too. You're not necessarily stopping it, even though that boulder is culpable for sliding. So fear is contagious itself. So we saw, I don't know if you remember, I can't remember, was H1N1 or which one it was in 2009. I remember I kept watching. I was like, there's some kind of weird moral contagion was almost starting. I kept talking about China, and then suddenly it fizzled out, right? Something about the network dynamics it didn't go viral in the meme-like sense. But you could see something was about to happen. And I don't know why it died out, but this is the nature of memetic or any kind of virality, just like your tweets. Some of your tweets suddenly might explode to like 15 retweets, like in like 10 minutes. You're like, oh, it's gonna, and then just it doesn't. Right? Just these things have a kind of physics to them in terms of these inverse scaling laws as to how rare they are as they get more viral, and they're very hard to. But every once in a while, and more common than exponentially rare, but still very rare because it's an inverse power law. you can get these high virality cases, and this is made worse in cases like fear, because like, if you've ever walked at night to your car and something spooks you, and now you're more likely to see stimuli and interpret them in a scary-like way, which then scares you more, which makes you more likely to interpret these things, right, in a scary-like way. So, but soon you're like running, peeing yourself, making it to your car, right? I mean, like, and that's never happened to me, John, but I hear that it's happened to people. And now imagine I'm with you and I see you looking frightened. And so I start to look frightened, and then you look at me like, okay, Mark's frightened. That encourages me to be frightened. So we can positively reinforce that fear on ourselves as well. And so these kinds of things quickly encouraged, or it was much more likely to be flammable, the kind of meme that was traveling through. And it's not just a meme of fear. If it was a meme of fear for locusts coming to eat our crops, we would all band together and huddle together and work together. This was a fear of infectiousness, of goopy, cooties-like things that can infect you from other people. It made every human our enemy. And so it's a very social attack, and it undermines the fabric of society. These kinds of things.
I think Dr. Vinay Prasad was saying that physicians were afraid they were going to get infected and die. And that, not since Ebola, but we didn't have that many cases, has it really been that personal for physicians and for RNs and physicians' assistants, where they were afraid they were going to die. And that made this, I guess, somewhat unique. And I guess it was the physician in China, 30-something-year-old ophthalmologist, who supposedly reports this thing and then dies. Very, very few men in their 30s were dying of COVID in America. But
can you ever figure out what the story was with that? Because that's not the story. Whatever that was.
Yeah, I don't have a whole lot of faith in that story. I think that was somewhat manufactured by somebody somewhere. I'm not buying it.
On December 30 of 2019, this man, Dr. Li Wenliang, informed his friends and colleagues about the danger of a new virus that is similar to SARS, the outbreak who killed thousands of people around the world. When the warning of potential danger became public, the government punished and accused him of making false comments on the internet.
It's such a rare scenario. In other words, the way he presented and the way that story came together just didn't seem to add up. So I was hoping to talk a little bit about some cognitive biases. Is that something you're comfortable digging into? Anchoring bias, availability, heuristic bias? Because
I mean, I know about them, but I'm no special insights in terms of many of those, other than just I know a bit about them. But
it's just something that I've explored a bit, and they just sort of stand out to me as I've investigated two apparently rather large cover-ups, which is why I'm incognito. The reason I'm incognito, for the people who are watching that know you and don't know me that well, is because of these ad hominem attacks, because it seems that if you step out of line, they go after your medical license. They go after, with lawfare in the case of some people. Dr. Simone Gold was in prison for 60 days for doing something unrelated, but possibly because she spoke out. So these ad hominem attacks have been ruthless. And I think the combination of that leads to the spiral of silence, right? People then are afraid to speak out. Nobody's going to step out of line if you're going to lose your medical license, and if they're going to take it from somebody like a Dr. Paul Marik or Dr. Scott Jensen or what have you. Aaron Kheriaty, Dr. Aaron Kheriaty lost his position, I think, at University of California, one of their teaching hospitals. It's ruthless. And so
a lot of folks, again, just to sort of cover it in a different way, a lot of folks purposely keep their mouth shut, but a lot of folks don't even begin to think thoughts that could lead to other thoughts that could get them kicked out, because they kind of know that those thoughts are verboten. And I think even before they even move down that line, that pressure, unbeknownst to them, just brings them in line with the narrative and helps push them into the narrative. And then they come to truly believe the narrative. They don't believe that they're keeping their mouths shut for their safety. They don't believe that at all, and they wouldn't be lying to you if they told you that. But in fact, it would be one of the reasons that they are at the position that they are now.
There's another phenomenon, which is that this normalcy bias, which is that when things haven't happened before, people have a very hard time accepting that this is happening for the first time ever. So normalcy bias, and it's something that something like 60% of the population has normalcy bias. So when presented with a completely new circumstance that they've never seen or heard of before, they're likely to dismiss it or not accept it because it hasn't happened before. And that's normalcy bias, or at least that's my butchering of normalcy bias. And
well, yeah, I don't know that, but you could argue that what we saw was one facet of what we saw was the opposite of that, because they insisted that a respiratory virus, which has many other cousin respiratory viruses named after it, but it's just a coronavirus, was altogether novel, right? They insisted it was novel. Like they refused to believe that it was anything but novel. And
right.
In fact, how you talk. They threw away all of their prior probabilities. That we have tremendous prior probabilities on the nature of these respiratory viruses, seasonality, their typical IFR, the steep curve as a function of them, as a function of age. All of these things were completely thrown out the window. And when it's thrown out the window, by which I mean your priors are suddenly set to all flat, as if you don't know any of those things, then it truly does take a lot of evidence, new evidence, to suddenly get to the point where you know all the things that you should have known or assumed were baseline from the start, right?
Yes, very important. And again, this is one of those first principle elements. I feel like nobody said, well, wait a second, has anybody here taken a baseline? Have we looked at respiratory deaths over the last 8 years and assessed that? And now what are we looking at here? And where do we stand? Because if we had done that, the 3,500 people that were dead in Wuhan wouldn't have amounted to much.
Right. And I was screaming about that, back in 2016 and 17 or 17, 18, there was about two winters in Italy, for example, where they had tremendous flu deaths just 4 or so years before 2020. And they were huge, massive flu deaths. And pointing out that these things happen. This is but none of us pay attention because there's always massive flu deaths over every winter, every year, most of which aren't even categorized as flu deaths because they take out mostly old people with comorbidities and you just say they died of old age, right?
That's right. Well, it turns out that it looks like there's been some strange behavior at the CDC in the United States, because they went from just talking about influenza to bundling influenza with pneumonia and calling it PNI, and then presenting something I guess they started doing about 10 years ago after the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic. They introduced this notion of influenza burden. And every time I make a video about influenza burden, it gets in trouble with YouTube. But influenza burden is a calculation. And it looks at hospitalizations, and it's trying to figure out, well, how many people are really dying from influenza that we don't know about? But we have death certificates that list it as a cause of death. So for those of us who don't really care about hospital utilizations and beds and things like that, we just want to know how many people died of influenza. Well, they track this thing called PNI, and they've been tracking PNI for years. And I started baselining PNI when this happened to say, well, how many people die from tuberculosis? How many people die from influenza? How many people die from other respiratory infections? How many people die from norovirus? You ever have that? You ever have norovirus in your stomach? It's like,
probably.
Oh
yeah,
my
I'm
God,
not sure.
horrifying. It is ruthless. And so I started to investigate that. And what I found is that the PNI deaths were much higher than the CDC had been reporting. In other words, the PNI deaths were like 180,000, 175,000 a year in the U.S., but the CDC, for some reason, was telling everybody 25,000, 45,000, 55,000 was the influenza burden.
Right. They have these models that they use. And I wouldn't even have minded those models if they had used the exact same systematic criteria to measure COVID-19. I understand they're both wrong, but you have to use the same measuring stick.
Exactly.
That's a bad one. That's fine. But the criteria by which they were historically measuring PNI was completely different. And I had long threads going through all of these things in March and April of 2020. And this was, of course, even assuming that these deaths were COVID deaths in March and April of 2020. Many of these things were, of course, iatrogenic deaths, not truly COVID deaths. I mean, they may have ended up with COVID or with flu. I'm not even sure that they had with COVID. But these were really human-induced accelerated deaths, not COVID.
And like you said before, there's so many factors here. There's so many facets. If you're running the PCR test at 42 cycles, we know you'll find SARS-CoV-2 in a piece of cantaloupe, right? So we know that. So I'm not surprised if 80% of the population tests positive at that many cycles. At the same time, though, there was a phenomenon that took place that, again, very few people either noticed it or very few people acknowledged it. And that is that in weeks 11 through 14 of 2020, influenza disappeared globally. Not just in the US, not just in the UK, everywhere except Cambodia. Cambodia, a different story. But in over 100 countries, influenza just disappeared. And I was like,
just because of masks. Of course, they hadn't started using masks then, but surely, John, it was just because the number of times people would actually say with a straight face on Twitter, it's because of the effectiveness of masks that we got rid of.
Right, it's working. And
why is it not going away? Well, and then they just create these post hoc stories which don't even make sense on their face.
Long ago, two friends having coffee together when something flies by their window. It might be out on that lawn, which is wide, at least half of a playing field. Because there's no explaining what your imagination can make you see and feel. Somebody needs nothing, you'll be hypnotized. It's not a meaningless question to ask if they've been and gone. I remember a talk about North Carolina in a strange, strange poem. You see, the sides were like glass in the thick of a forest without a road. And if any man's hand ever made that land, then I think it would have showed.
Yeah, it's bizarre. So I didn't know enough about epidemiology to know whether viral, viral conflict? What is it? There's a word for this.
Yeah, but that's between the same viruses, right? But that's between two of the same viruses, right? So one influenza will push out the other influenza. But coronavirus and influenza are like from two, it's like monkeys and dogs. They're not from the same part of the tree. They don't, they don't push one another out. So
I just wouldn't have known that. But what you should be able to know is that it happened instantaneously all over the world all at once. That's not any biological thing occurs. Right?
And that's absurd. And so I wrote a white paper, tongue in cheek, in October of 2020. Because there was a group of people that did write a white paper saying, what happened to influenza in South Africa, Chile, the United States, and Australia? It's gone. And I looked at this paper and said, well, that's interesting. What about Hungary? What about Sweden? What about Norway? What about Switzerland? What about Germany? We have the same phenomenon in over 100 countries. And you guys only listed 4? What about the other 108 I've got over here with the same exact phenomenon? Those didn't matter. Why would you leave those out?
Yeah, it's one of these situations. The more that it can show the effect that they're pointing to, the more ridiculous it sounds. Because usually you want more data, but when there's that much, it's a systematic
it's
artifact.
absurd. Exactly, it's absurd. And when you see in certain countries, I'll put it up on the screen here for the audience, like in Hungary, it's going up, 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 and at the peak, it's just gone.
Yeah.
And the odd thing is, then I lay in the COVID deaths on top of that. I overlay it. Uh-oh. It's like magic decoder rings that fit together, right?
Yeah.
I hate that part because that makes it seem like it's a conspiracy. It's like, so all of a sudden influenza disappeared from over 100 countries around the world in 28 days? And there were how many? Wait a second. In week 11 of 2020, Mark, how many people were infected with COVID? Not that many, and not that many died. Even in Italy, for influenza to just be pushed out, viral interference, they're not the same virus. In fact, what's the number one comorbidity of COVID? Influenza pneumonia, with over 500,000 in the US. Almost half of the deaths have got PNI.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that brings up normalcy bias. We've never seen anything this evil before. It brings up availability heuristic bias, which is if you haven't seen this data, you think you're at the finish line. You think you figured out, meaning, all these doctors I see on Twitter who are ready to go to court. I'm like, whoa, 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 whoa. You don't charge into battle when you don't have all the data. And if you don't fully understand what happened here, you're going to make an ass of yourself in public. That's what's going to happen. There's way more to the story than I think anybody realizes. And early on, I got wind of this deception. But like you, I at the very early stages, I bought the whole wet market bat soup. I used to shop in wet markets in Thailand all the time. I said, sure, yeah. They got turtles and eels and frogs right next to each other. Of course, there's going to be fascinating viruses in there. Didn't surprise me in the least. And then I looked at the map, and it was all red. And there weren't 10 people dead in Shanghai, and there was no one dead in Vietnam. It was all red. And it was from the Michael Bloomberg School of Health too.
Yeah.
Michael.
Well, the deaths wouldn't really get going until the lockdowns started. That was the trigger.
What do you think happened? So you brought this up earlier, March 10th, March 11th. Something happened. Something changed. And by March 13th, President Trump declares a national emergency. That was the Friday in front of the White House. And he comes out, he's got 60 people filing out of the Oval Office. And they declare this national emergency. Why do you think there was such this massive pivot in the March 10th, 11th timeframe? What the hell happened there?
It's one person coming in from China, and we have it under control. It's going to be just fine.
It seemed like this was an issue contained to China.
The city at the center of the outbreak in China and 2 others going on lockdown.
The risk is low in the United States. The risk is low.
So at least 565 people are dead and more than 28,000 infected with coronavirus around the world. That's if the Chinese are telling the truth.
Should we have been more aggressive with China and put their feet to the fire? I mean, obviously, history has told us that the president was not interested in doing that.
I had a great conversation last night with President Xi.
I really believe they are going to have it under control fairly soon. You know, in April, supposedly, it dies with the hotter weather.
The Centers for Disease Control says the coronavirus is going to spread in the United States, but the White House today said that it's contained.
Our country couldn't accept or would not accept the implications of what we were finding.
One person with coronavirus in King County, Washington State, has died.
9 Americans now have died.
11 people have died from coronavirus.
Tonight, the first containment zone here in America within a 1-mile radius in the New York suburb of New Rochelle.
And then suddenly here it was in our own community.
Here's what's making headlines on this March 11th.
Good morning on this Wednesday, March 11th.
Wednesday, March 11th.
Hope you guys are exhaling, taking a minute for yourselves in the midst of all the chaos and confusion.
I just looked at my notes from that day, and it was a most unusual day. I was testifying before the House Energy and Commerce Oversight and Reform hearing.
Well, I mean, it's not, you can't really. I mean, there were, of course, significant events. The WHO presented evidence to a congressional hearing where they, amongst the many panicked and mistaken things that they did, they mistakenly compared the case fatality rate of COVID to the infection fatality rate of flu. And infection fatality rates are often orders of magnitude lower than case fatality rates. And so people left that meeting or heard during the congressional hearings a factor of 10 average IFR, believing that it was 10 times worse than flu, which was completely wrong, and ended up, of course, believing that it was 300 times worse than by the time it trickles through the population. So things had already been ramping up, this kind of collective hysteria, and people going, all right, this is super dangerous. There's all that people were talking about. And so I don't know exactly when, but somewhere around that week, it became a kind of new religion. The entire world really felt like you had to stand arm in arm with everybody around you and do this. And so, and a lot of politicians who initially pushed for herd immunity, like Boris Johnson, is trying to calm people, said, look, we've got to go for herd immunity. You go back and you see them talking about this. This is all what people forget what happened. And now the WhatsApp leaks or whatever came out. And there was so much pressure bottom up saying you can't do that. The bottom up from many, not just from the man on the street, but from all the different kinds of institutions forcing it. Even in China, this Ben Irvine, he's covered this nicely, the truth about the Wuhan lockdowns. Originally, the CCP was like, we're not going to go do anything. They don't really want to wreck their economy. They're barely able to keep their economy going. They don't want to go wreck it, but the people didn't trust the government. They themselves were involved in the same kind of, and so they put so much pressure that the government says, okay, we've got to look like we're leading. Okay, we were always going to do something. Now that they went ahead and did strong leading, and all of these things are not as simple as people tend to think. That this is all top down. Of course, in collective hysteria, you end up with top down stuff. That's because top down is one of the main directions of bottom up, because each individual there is also a person hearing all the same influences everybody else is and feeling compelled. And if they want to keep their job, they better damn well do it because the whole populace is demanding it. The way that we can tell that it's not top down is because everywhere that you went, people were enforcing it on the street. People were wearing masks in cars. Two months later, a whole city's every man and woman on the street, every person going out on a boat, crew teams by themselves on a canoes had masks, N95 masks, in a city where it wasn't mandated outdoors. right? So you have these are the signs that this was much more than just and much more dangerous. This is much scarier, infinitely scarier. In fact,
have you ever seen anything like this in your life? I mean,
for me, so yes and no. So my family comes from Iran. I'm half Iranian. My wife is from Iran. Dad came from Iran, and in that country, I've never experienced it myself, but I'm always hearing the stories, and especially the women, in hijab is a constant daily threat. It's the man and woman on the street yelling and pouring juice on them if they're not wearing, or maybe throwing acid on them for not wearing their hair right. The closest that I ever had to experiencing anything like this, to what we experienced, right, was when the hostage crisis happened in 1979, and suddenly everybody who didn't know shit about Iran or give a shit about Iran, suddenly Iranians and Persians were
right.
Yeah. Right. So my parents told me, okay, you're not Iranian anymore, you're Persian. And every Iranian carpet store suddenly switched over to a Persian carpet store because people didn't really have that stereotype. They didn't really know what Persia was. So
this was in New Jersey? You grew up in New Jersey, right? Or in Virginia?
No, I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, Fairfax, Virginia.
Okay, Virginia. Okay. So you were born in Jersey, but you kind of grew up in Virginia.
So I was born, it turns out, in New Jersey, yeah. So no one was ever mean to me or anything like this, but to this day, the narrative of our enemy being Iran has stuck. That's still with us 40 years later. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Interesting how we manage that. Yeah.
And this was a great experience, and it was an awful experience. I only mean it in the sense that often when we will think about other countries like Iran that had to deal with this, or Cultural Revolution in China, or the Nazis. We make stereotypes of Nazis. Germans are this way, so we say shit about Germans, and we blame the Germans because they can be sticklers, or we say the Chinese or they're these foreign people, or Iranians come from this fucked up Islamic religion, so that's why. No, it has nothing to do with any of that, right? It is because they are human, and we are all susceptible to these psychosocietal emergent phenomena that can happen. And all of these things are the same thing. They just differ in the icing. Same stuff, and we all witnessed it. And unfortunately, what I'm batting my head against the wall every day for 2 years is trying to explain to two classes of people that it's the same totalitarian forces that we just went through. Half of the population, but I don't mean actual half, but one huge group is just those that fell into collective hysteria. They now have calmed down, but they don't think it was collective hysteria. Lockdowns were justified, masks were justified. I don't know what you're on about, Mark. Just calm down. It was fine. No, it wasn't fine, right? The other big group are the pandemic types that are, on one sense, they're on my side, but they don't get that these totalitarian forces are always potentially there, and the great democides and genocides are always due to this. And it wasn't because someone purposely started the mass hysteria, collective hysterias. They're almost impossible to purposely. You can't purposely engineer them at step 17 in your 43-step plan, because it's an incredible roll of a dice. It's really hard to do. But of course, once they get going, there's tremendous numbers of bad actors that can leverage it, usually for the good. They believe they're doing some good. And there's tons of reasons for why authoritarian actors like the Great Reset people and the WHO made things much worse, because they have events like Event 201 and lots of stuff like that, which were basically traps ready to spring to help us if something like this happened. But all the shit that they've have ready to spring out are exactly stuff that makes it worse, like censorship of misinformation and all this type of stuff. But you can go watch Event 201. They're all just these blowhard, better, smarter than you academics who think that all of their authoritarianism is going to help.
Indeed. And they want more money.
They want more money to continue to help, right?
I posted something on Twitter a couple days ago, and it went semi-viral for my posts, where Joe Biden is saying we need more money for the next pandemic.
Well, we'll get through at least this year. We do need more money. But we don't just need more money for vaccines for children eventually. We need more money to plan for the second pandemic. There's going to be another pandemic. We have to think ahead.
Didn't you just go through $10 billion or something with this one? And to your point, we do Event 2. By the way, Event 201 was only 3 hours long. It was an afternoon session. The year or two before that, they did one called Clade X. And Clade X was a little bit longer.
Given it, I think, all of the attention that it deserves.
Last May, Johns Hopkins University put together an exercise to simulate what could happen in the next flu pandemic.
This news just in.
Congresswoman Susan Brooks of Indiana, who's co-sponsored legislation to bolster the nation's preparedness for public health emergencies, was part of the exercise.
Every time You do an exercise, you realize where the gaps are. If large numbers of people begin to get sick, actually your economy is impacted, our national security can be impacted. There's so many things that people just don't realize.
In this scenario, a year and a half into the pandemic, the hypothetical Clade X flu had killed 150 million people worldwide. A vaccine was still stuck in development. The U.S. president and vice president were both sickened, as was a third of Congress. The U.S. government nationalized the entire healthcare system to coordinate its response. And all of these were considered realistic projections.
These are the types of things that most citizens don't think about. We don't want to think about them, but yet we expect the systems to be in place to take care of them. We expect the medical community, pharmaceutical community, diagnostic community, everyone to be ready, and that's not how it works.
We also did one called Crimson Contagion, and that was a real exercise. So Event 201 gets a lot of press, but we've been doing these things for years. And Johns Hopkins sponsors them. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation sponsors them. Every year they do this, and they got the chicken dinners and they got the award ceremonies, and then they bring in the Beach Boys one night, and they do this every year.
They do it not just for that; they do it for many different kinds of potentialities. What if AI takes over? There's all these. There's so much money in these.
And there's a plan. They've got a plan too. They've got a plan too. They got a White House document that says, in the event of some sort of global pandemic after the Clade X event, here's what we're going to do. But you see how well it worked? Not very well at all. Yeah, not very well at all. If we have a million dead in America, and India has half of that, with 4.5 times our population.
Yeah. Well, imagine how much worse it would have been if we didn't lock down, John. Right? They literally
could have been so much worse. Like, it could have been so much worse. I mean, think about Elmo, right? We lost Elmo, and that's tragic, right? It could have been so. Thank God he was vaccinated 5 times. It could have been so much worse. The whole thing is just unbelievable to people who think critically and use first principles and say, well, wait, okay, I hear the story, I hear you, but I'm going to check and I want to take a look.
You have to really go back to first principles and think things out for yourself, whether they're scientific principles or moral principles or business ideas or product ideas. Question experts. To question authorities figures. Don't assume just because they're an authority or even just because they're an expert that they're right. In other words, think things out for yourself. Come to your own judgments. Don't simply conform to conventional ways of thinking, conventional ways of dressing, conventional ways of acting. That a lot of things are based on fashion. Even morality at times is based on fashion. It was once slavery was once not considered not to be immoral. People are shocked that the ancient Greeks had slaves, that we had slavery in this country as recently as 130, 140 years ago. There are an enormous number of people in the world who really want standard answers. They want everyone to wear their hair the same way, everyone to conduct business the same way, everyone to dress the same way, everyone to go to the same church. There's a very and if you wander outside of these norms, people are highly critical because it's threatening to them. Because they're living their life one way and they believe that's the proper way to live their life. And if you live your life a different way and you answer questions differently, that makes them feel very uncomfortable. And they say, well, this person's different from I am, and then they simply go a little further, and they say this person's different and wrong. Again, and I try to reason things back from first principles. I try to think about things and come to conclusions and make my own decisions. And if other people if I've thought things through, if someone has a logical criticism and can explain to me why what I'm doing is wrong, and they can convince me, I'll change. If they really can, if they have good reasons, I'll just alter my behavior. I love it when people point out I'm wrong, explain to me why I'm wrong, and I then change. That's great. I don't want to be wrong. I would love to be right.
And for those of us who've done that, again, the disconnect. One of these phenomenons that I see is that the greater the delta between the published narrative, okay, the standard narrative, which is, well, what's the story? COVID came from wherever, did this, did that, and we locked the world down. Versus, well, what actually happened here? When the delta is great, so as that delta increases, the ability for people to accept the alternate narrative is harder and harder, the bigger the gap. In other words, so if the real story is something completely different from what you were told, people are like, what? That doesn't make any sense. How could that possibly be the case? And nobody reported it, right? Yeah. And so I've seen some examples of that through this, but I've taken a bunch of your time. We've been going well over an hour. Is there something that you'd like to leave the audience with that really stands out, that you would want to share with them as we wrap this up?
Well, I did want to mention, in the light, one of the reasons these narratives don't go away, and this is true about all kinds of narratives, but narratives have many of the properties of blockchains. The reason blockchains work as a decentralized mechanism for cryptocurrency is that they're decentralized, distributed, but it creates kind of like a story of who sent Bitcoin to who this week, and it gets added to the ledger and added to the ledger. And the way that they're glued together each day or each week are certain kinds of either proof of stake or proof of work. Each of those has analogies on the gossip side. When a society has, in a small society, you and I might have gotten into an argument, and then it's remembered later, yeah, Mark was a big douchebag to John, and he kept saying bullshit, and then John showed that Mark was wrong, so Mark lost a lot of social reputation. Mark lost a lot of reputation that John gains, right? So reputation is also a distributed, decentralized currency. It's not kept by a central bank. Only way it works in a community is that then people later talk about it, and then it's in the heads of everybody of what happened, and it's added to the story, like a good story. And good stories are hard to find. They elegantly summarize and fit the new stuff to the personalities and characteristics, so it kind of fits the old stuff, and that's hard to find. It's just like proof of work. It's easy to verify that it's a good story, but hard to compute. So good gossipers, or the community comes up with good explanations that nicely fits. And so once you have years worth of these add-ons to the social narratives, each one sort of explaining why this makes sense, it's unbreakable and unroll backable for all the same reasons, analogous reasons that block.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant, yet
is impervious to fucking.
It makes me yearn for yesteryear, where everything you just described happened organically, and there was no Vijaya Gandhi with her finger on the scale. Because I feel like what you just described, if allowed to happen organically, and if ideas and posits are allowed to flow, it's remarkable. And when we start seeing fingers going on the scale, whether it's Vijaya Gandhi or Susan Wojcicki or whoever it is that, decides that, well, no, we don't want people to hear that, the Great Barrington thing, or we don't want people to hear this from this doctor or whatever. And so we're just going to suppress that. And so now there's this inorganic aspect to it where it's been pruned.
Yeah. The forces of centralized censorship, whether it was at just the behest of private companies without federal involvement, or what's in fact the case, massive federal involvement has made the rise of ill narratives much more likely, right? Enforcing consensus ensures groupthink, because even 51% towards one thing, then you should, let's just favor that 51%. It's a positive feedback loop, which immediately will tend to push towards groupthink, and that's what happened. Maybe if I had to finish, one thing to point out before I finish is our lawsuit, Daniel Kotzen, Michael Sanger, and myself, it's Changizi versus the Department of Health and Human Services, suing the federal government for First Amendment violations. We were the first lawsuit. The Missouri and Louisiana, we were dismissed. Louisiana and Missouri came after ours. They made it farther. We are in appeal right now. We have about 7 or 8 amicus briefs written in our defense. You can find all of these things at Free Expression Institute. The freex.group it talks about my research institute on totalitarianism and free expression, and also will walk you through where our First Amendment case is.
That's just fantastic. I've got that up on the screen so people can see that. And for people who are colorblind and want to learn more about the glasses so that they can experience things differently, they can go to Vino. It's vino.vi or Vino.
Optics.com, vinooptics.com, or also vino.vi.
There we go. All right. So I'll put that up on the screen. And so for those of you who are colorblind, speak to your ophthalmologist about it as well, or your optometrist. And you can go right to the website and learn more about that. I can't thank you enough. This has been fascinating. And I think your observations are, they're chilling. And I'm hoping that we have more people who are willing to exhibit first principles and think for themselves moving forward. I mean, that's what we can hope and pray for. But again, I can't thank you enough. I'm incredibly grateful.
It was a pleasure to be here. Great to have a chance to talk with you.
All righty. You're welcome back anytime. Anytime. Thanks a million.